Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to talk about how the Articles of Confederation essentially failed, right, and then provided the impetus for the Constitution we have today in the Second Constitutional Convention. Um, so some of this touches on the themes of the previous video from Professor Boucher, right? So if you think back to kind of the colonial legacy and home rule, right, the Declaration of Independence happens in 1776, but we don't actually get the Constitution that we have today and that we're going to be talking about, right, kind of as the core rule book throughout the course until 1788. So the big question, right, is what happens in this interceding period? And as highlighted in the previous video, right? We have the Articles of Confederation, and just to recap some kind of central pieces here, so we can talk about how they fail and where their problems lie. We have a very weak central government with the states, given their legacy of kind of self-governing home rule, right, are very independent to do what they want. And there's a legislature. Every state, no matter its population, no matter its size, has one vote. And in fact, it requires a supermajority to get things done in here. So it requires 13, so unanimous, right, every single state for amendments, right? And you need 9 out of 13 for what they term major laws, which are kind of anything of importance. There's also no clear power to tax or collect revenue for the national government. Right, when we think about this, right, the Revolutionary War is being fought in Rhode Island, right, which encompasses only 2% of the population, effectively vetoes a tax, right, an amendment to the articles to fund this particular conflict. There are a number of other issues, right? There's no clear executive, right? So no clear military or foreign policy leadership, which is crucial, right, in a time of crisis and war. And there's no clear national court system to resolve disputes. So there are a number of these issues, right, that are here where you have these states bound together, right, but the central government still remains quite weak. And so a couple different episodes really lay bare the problems of this type of government, of this confederation. First, right, the Revolutionary War is being fought during this period, right? And in fact, fighting a war, right, requires military leadership, requires foreign policy leadership, right, requires the armies to be funded, right, for equipment and, of course, paying the soldiers. And as such, right, there are a lot of issues under the Articles because this lack of power to tax, right, and it's unclear exactly kind of who's leading the country in its charge, right, in this revolution. And in fact, right, during the conflict itself, there are many of the framers themselves, right, are keenly aware of these limitations, right? In fact, Alexander Hamilton, right, in 1780, noted that the Confederation itself is defective, excuse me, and requires to be altered, right? That it's not fit for war, in particular, but also or peace. And in fact, a number of these issues, right, prevent the government from acting quickly and behaving kind of in a manner that is has integrity. Second, right, later, right after the conflict is ended, we see Shays' rebellion. So Daniel Shays leads several thousand kind of many former soldiers, right, in the revolutionary conflict in Western Massachusetts, right? It basically a revolt over the fact that kind of they were being taxed, but also right that many had not been effectively paid for their service. And the national government has a really hard time kind of putting down this revolt from these soldiers because they don't have kind of the army to do so, nor do they have kind of the funding capabilities to resolve the kind of the quarrel with the soldiers. And in fact, right, in addition to Hamilton and Madison and a Federalist paper, which will be talked about a bit in the next video, right, is that one of the things in designing a constitution for the United States is that you need to require right stability and energy in government, right, so that the government can be stable, can put down rebellions, right, but also have energy and act when it needs to, but also right respect liberty, right, and in particular the Republican form of government that we'll be talking about. So there are a number of issues with the articles, and in fact, there's a nice little table in your text, right, in the reading, right, about the various issues and why they were a problem for the functionality of the early United States government, right, because of the quality of kind of voting, Smaller states, right, may had an outsized say over large states. There's no clear executive, right? There's no national judicial system, right? The national government is extraordinarily weak. And so we end up in a situation with a lot of issues. So, the brief recap of what we've been talking about so far, and in particular what has happened in American politics up until this point, right? Monarchy is bad, right, under the British King, right, and so there's the Declaration of Independence, and we get out that, but also quite clearly in the opposite direction, right? The articles in which you have these states kind of loosely banded together, right? Kind of at the other extreme from a monarchy where everything is centrally controlled, right? It also have some problems. So we end up, right, finally kind of having another constitutional convention in 1787 to attempt to rectify a number of these issues with the articles, which motivate many of the compromises that get built into the Constitution. So the question then before the framers is what to do? What do they do about these various issues under the articles? Right? Given their skepticism of a strong national government because of the time under the king, right? But at the other extreme, right, a very weak national government is failing. So how do you kind of do it just right, somewhere in the middle? In the first major proposal, right, and the first major thing that's discussed in this constitutional convention comes from Madison. And in particular, right, if you've ever done kind of group work and someone shows up with a lot of the work done already and into the thing and kind of everyone just adopts it because they have to, right? Madison brings what's termed the Virginia Plan. We'll talk exactly about what this plan entails and puts it on the table, kind of a starting point for discussion, right, and a starting point for negotiation. Right, Virginia, along with New York, right, are the most populous states. So this plan is highly favorable, right, to these larger states, right, that want more of an outsized say in the national government. In response to this, Patterson puts forward the New Jersey plan, who's Patterson's from New Jersey, right, at the time a somewhat smaller state in terms of population, right, trying to preserve many of the pieces of the articles, and in some sense, right, not necessarily its own kind of ironclad plan, but just a response, a big pushback on the Virginia plan. And then finally, we end up with what's termed the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, right, in the Constitution itself and what we have that comes out of both of these plans. So I want to talk through each in detail. The first is that in the Virginia plan, right, it is a much stronger national government than under the Articles. And in particular, popular sovereignty is with the House. That is, voters in the respective states, right, will vote for members of a House of Representatives. And rather than just having a unicameral or single legislature, right, you have a bicameral one, you have a Senate as well. Right, but what's interesting and different than our current setup is that the members of the House, right, would select the members of the Senate. Right, originally in the constitutional compromise we get, right, the senators are selected by state legislatures and then later directly elected. But in this Mott plan, right, the House would select the Senate, right, and in fact, the state legislatures would nominate the senators here, but the House would have say over it. Um, Notably, the Senate would also be proportional, right, to state size and population. And then kind of floating out to the right in this diagram, we have the national executive, right, and a judiciary. So you have these pieces that are notably absent from the articles, but they're still not kind of fully formed or fully fleshed out. In response, right, the New Jersey plan is still stronger, to be clear, than the articles, but not as strong as the Virginia plan. And in fact, right, there's no popular sovereignty here, right? So it would be unicameral. You would have one legislature, and the representatives would be selected by the states. So within each state, right, voters could vote for the state legislatures, but then the people that get sent to the national government, right, are chosen by these legislatures. And preserving a piece that was problematic, right, for the larger states under the articles, every state still would get one vote here. And in particular, right, while the New Jersey plan now has an executive, right, and courts, unlike the articles, it would be a plural executive. So you effectively have the executive branch being essentially being a committee, right, that would be appointed by the legislature, and then the courts, right, would be selected by this particular executive. So there's more in the book, right, about the nitty-gritty details of these. But what's important about each of these plans is that the Constitution is built from pieces of both, right? And a lot of the debates about how to fix the problems of the articles, right, um, yield a lot of discussion about various principles that they should kind of abide by when creating the Constitution, but it also creates some particular complications. That is, it's not just the simplest document that could be produced. And in particular, there are a number of important compromises that we should talk about between both these plans as well as the articles. One big piece, right, is about how much power should the federal government have versus states. At the time, right, the framers are extraordinarily concerned with making right not a national government that's not too strong, but also strong enough to solve the problem under the articles. And so they are clear, right, that the kind of the compromise that gets built into our Constitution, that there's no federal kind of veto over states, although when laws are in conflict, right, the supremacy clause in the Constitution does note that the federal law is supreme. And in particular, in Article 1, when describing the power of Congress at the national level, there are enumerated powers. That is, the powers that Congress has are listed out, not just a general loose grant of power here, in an effort to kind of constrain the focus of the national government and leaving, right, reserving many of these powers to the states. Another big compromise and debate over these plans is about how power should be distributed within the particular pieces. And so we end up, right, with kind of our system of checks and balances, and powers are separated between the branches as laid out in the Constitution, where you have the ability of each kind of each branch, right, to push back on what the other branches are doing, kind of woven through a number of different mechanisms here, so that one branch does not become overly powerful, or at least that is the goal. And finally, and crucially important for the debates at the time, right, is the issue of slavery. And in particular, exactly how large states and small states would be counted as large and small states, and whether slaves would count as persons for the act of apportioning representation. So we end up with a log roll essentially here. We're a legislative kind of vote trade where the South, right, still gets kind of broad powers and a broad grant of allowing to continue chattel slavery, whereas the North gets interstate commerce power. That is, they can regulate commerce between the states, right, as well as kind of benefit financially from this industry. Right? And so there are three places where slavery is kind of explicitly written into the Constitution. Right? The first is the three-fifths compromise. So rather than have slaves count as whole persons or not count at all, right? Kind of the two extreme ends of the options here for apportioning members of the House, they end up counting right as three-fifths of a person. So for all the slaves, you get to essentially 60% in terms of apportioning members of the House. Right. We also see written into the Constitution that there's kind of no ban, or that Congress can make no ban on the slave import, right, until 1808, right, roughly 20, or essentially 20 years after its ratification, right. And we also see a fugitive slave clause written in. So there are a number of basics, right, kind of that get built into our Constitution, right, that are, by basics, I mean things that seem like common knowledge today about how American government operates. We end up with a bicameral legislature, right, so there's not just one chamber, right, we have a House and a Senate. The House, right, in an effort to make the larger states happy, right, is apportioned by population. This is why we have the census, right? Don't forget to fill out your census forms this year. And then the Senate, right? And the Senate, unlike the House, right, is equal by state, right? So the idea of a legislature in the New Jersey plan and the idea of a legislature in the Articles of Confederation is somewhat preserved in the Senate with this equality where you have two per state. And these originally, right, are selected by the state legislatures. This is later amended. We also see a singular executive, right? We see what is right, we know as the president, right, is built into the Constitution to allow for more concerted, kind of quick action in crisis. And finally, we have the courts. right, laid out specifically, right? Both kind of the executive and courts are missing from the articles. And in particular, the Constitution notes that there's a Supreme Court, but then also gives authority to Congress to make more, right? We currently have kind of a three-tiered federal court system, right? And this power is given to Congress. And so if you look at the Constitution and what's there, and I want to go briefly through parts of it, particularly where there are important pieces of compromise, right, and important kind of things worth pointing out that we'll be coming back to throughout the quarter. So in particular, right, what ends up being ratified in 1788, and Professor Boucher will talk a bit about ratification in the next video, right, we end up with 7 articles. First and foremost, right, we have Congress, then we have the executive, the courts, right, and then obviously there are 13 states it's ratified and how we might add them, right, how in Article 5 about how to change it, recognizing, right, that it's a problematic kind of feature of the articles that it was so hard to change and so hard to do other things, um, as well as other miscellaneous things, right, in Articles 6 and 7. One clear thing, right? Please read this, right? It's a assigned reading for this week. We'll be talking about its role and in particular how it influences, right, the various institutions and other pieces throughout the quarter. So it's an important foundational thing for this course. So what are some compromises, right, in the Constitution itself that we get? So Article 1 put up front, right, the legislature is predominant, right? Congress is predominant and put first because it's where the seat, kind of the most important kind of branch in many of the framers' minds in terms of where powers are located. So there are a number of pieces here, right? Section 2 of Article 1, right, describes the House in particular, notes exactly, right, that it'll be apportionment that viz, the House will be kind of weighted by the size of states in terms of the population, including the 3/5 clause, which we've already discussed. Right. We also, right, describe the Senate here, noting in particular, right, that state legislatures will select them. Another big thing we'll come back to when we talk about Congress, Section 5 basically says whatever congressional rules are is up to the chamber, right? And so this creates a lot of incentives and a lot of interesting rule structures when we come back to that. Right. And Section 7, right, is your favorite, how a bill becomes law, right, describing the process by which right, new laws come into force. And including, right, noting and describing some of the checks and balances here, right, an important one of the veto, right, is, right, that the president, right, can effectively veto legislation. Right. So later in Article 1, there's more, right, there's the enumerated powers in Section 8, right? Again, right, this is an important compromise in terms of federal versus state power, where the powers are enumerated here, not just broad grants. So what's in Section 8? Lots of stuff, right? So laying and collect taxes, right? This is a big issue and big problem under the articles, right? Borrowing, right? Allowing the country to take on debt, right? Regulating commerce, right? This is known as a commerce clause and is crucially important in the discussions of federalism and federal power, right? Making courts, right, inferior to the Supreme Court, right? Again, another kind of power to check the judicial branch. Right? Note that Congress, right, has the power to declare war and support armies, right? And also another important clause when we talk about federalism, right, the necessary and proper clause, also known sometimes as elastic clause, right, is that you can do things a little bit beyond these enumerated powers in order to kind of carry them out. But also there are limits, right? So Section 9 has what the federal government can't necessarily do, right? Noting that they can't ban the import of slaves until 1808, and a lot more, including, right, the emoluments clause, which is the subject of a number of pieces of litigation regarding the current president. Right, notably preventing, right, any member of government without the consent of Congress, right, from accepting present or emolument or payment, right, from any foreign state here. So Congress, right, is predominant in this compromise, but we also then have an executive, right, and we didn't have an executive or a kind of a clear power structure under the Articles, which created many of the problems. And in these debates, right, it's important to kind of note that a lot of ideas were tossed out in terms of how the Constitution was coming together. And in particular, Alexander Hamilton gets laughed at a little bit by many of his compatriots because he proposes electing a president or an executive right for life, right? And this is not exactly what happens because they recognize, right, that it sounds a lot like a king and maybe is not as ideal, right, in terms of kind of the experiences many of the framers had under the British Crown. But what we ended up with, right, is the Electoral College. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about the president. But notably, right, there are a number of electors that are chosen. So each state gets a number equal to the number of representatives and senators. And states get to decide how electors are picked. And so these electors get together and select the president, right? And we'll talk about the kind of current interpretation and, right, and the current functionality of this. But at the time, why did they create this, right? Where the popular sovereignty, right, is with the House, but the people are not necessarily voting for the executive. First, it's largely a compromise they've already brokered in Article 1, right, in terms of the number of representatives and senators and how there's equality among states kind of in the Senate, but some disproportionality or some proportionality, excuse me, based on population in the House. There are also other practical compromises, right? Leaving this to the states, right? As you imagine running an election, right, several centuries ago, it's a little bit problematic. But arguably, they also note that it requires broad support. That is, you won't just get a northern candidate or a southern candidate all the time, but you'll require this broad geographic support here. Also, there's a great worry, right, and this will be discussed some in the next video by Professor Boucher, right, about kind of insulating it from the people a bit, is that there's this great fear among the framers, right, that if you go the direction of people having too much power, right, they may simply make poor choices. So Hamilton, right, in defending this choice of the Electoral College, right, notes that this process of election, the Electoral College is what he's describing, right, that his office of president will never fall to the lot of man who's not in eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications, right? That is, the best person will be chosen because of this. And so the framers set this up. We'll talk about as modern issues, right, when we get back to the presidency. There's other bits, right, importantly in Article 2 in the compromise, right, that is we get the vesting clause, right, that the executive power is vested in the president, right, and discusses how the Electoral College rules we were just talking about. Importantly, right, the goal of having an executive is you have a commander in chief that is in times of crisis and war, right, they can act quickly. So transaction costs, right, are low, right, in this is that you can have a president respond to crises with quite a bit of speed. Right. There are also other checks and balances, notably, right, the Senate, right, can advise has the power of advice and consent on treaties, right, but also the president can appoint people to courts, right, as well as ambassadors. There's more powers, right, including some clauses we'll talk about when we talk about the executive branch, right. Again, much shorter, though, than Article 1, right? Is the framers envision the president here as this powerful figure in times of crises, right? So the common kind of phrasing invoked is that they're a clerk and commander, that is, they're just caring about the day-to-day duties of the government, but don't play a massive role, right? And then in wartime and in crisis, they can lead the troops, right? And they can lead the country ahead. Also, the articles didn't have courts, and now we do, right? And the compromise that gets built. And in fact, right, what is kind of left before the Constitutional Convention is that, right, the Constitution creates one Supreme Court, but then Congress, right, has the power to create more in the future as they deem necessary. This is a place, right, that gives Congress quite a bit of say over, right, the judicial branch, even though they can't necessarily, right, kind of reorganize or kind of dramatically change the Supreme Court or kind of will it out of existence. They have the ability to influence it here, right? Notably, right, there's other definitions about what the court kind of has and can hear. It's extremely short in Article 3 as well, largely because, right, the framers envisioned the courts as a way to settle interstate disputes, right? This is a big problem under the articles. But when we come back to talking about the courts, judicial review, right, the main kind of check and balance we think of here with the courts allowed to declare acts of the executive and acts of Congress unconstitutional, is not laid out in the Constitution. And we'll come back to why that is later. The latter bits, right, we've kind of covered the three branches and the compromises there, but there are an important kind of other compromises built into the latter articles that I want to briefly talk about too. If you remember, when we get the Constitution, we have 13 states. We now have 50, right? So we needed these rules laid out in Article 4 37 times, right? It hasn't been used in the last half century, but right, has been used right quite prominently. Um, these are an important kind of bargaining chip, right? Because in order to be brought in, Congress has to approve these states, right? So throughout the 19th century, this was an issue for slavery in particular, as Southern states wanted to maintain their power in the Senate to prevent right slavery from being limited. Right, so, right, the provisions here, right, are importantly kind of used as a bargaining chip for much of the 19th century regarding issues of slavery, but these rules are important. Article 5, right, importantly, they realize one of the failures of the articles is it requires unanimity to change, that is, all 13 states had to agree in order to change the Constitution, right? So they set a lower bar in the constitutional compromise we get. And you can see in this graphic right here, essentially amending the Constitution requires 2/3, right, of both houses of Congress, which is important because that is not unanimous, but it's also not a bare majority, like in the state of California, which is why we have so many amendments to the Constitution. And then it requires 3/4 of the state legislature. That is, again, right, it sets a high bar, right, a high threshold for amending it, but not full unanimous, and not fully unanimous. So there have been 27 amendments, right, to the Constitution. And so they're pretty rare. The first 10, Professor Boucher will talk about in another video, right? The Bill of Rights, and then particularly the debate around rights and their inclusion, and particularly in the Constitution. And the most recent one was now a few decades ago regarding congressional pay and essentially allowing or preventing Congress from enriching themselves. The last two articles, right, are worth noting, kind of just in very brief form, right, is that there's about the national debt, about kind of the oaths that members of Congress and those in service of the government have to take, right? And then Article 7 specifies exactly how we would ratify the Constitution, noting that, right, in order to get rid of the articles and supplant them, right, something in kind of the back of this whole discussion is the articles are enforced while they're debating this new Constitution, is in order to replace the articles, right, you would have 9 states needed to ratify this. And finally, kind of in Article 7, I just want to point out this last bit here, right, is this is a handwritten document, right, that's hammered out by the framers. And so the last bit there is just fixing some typos here. Or as noted, right, and this is just a joke, the Onion is a satirical newspaper, right, is that there are many kind of differing interpretations of the Constitution because nobody can read it. This is a joke, right, this is not true. So what's important to take away from this video, right, is that the articles failed in particular ways. And as a reaction to it, the framers brought forward a number of solutions they thought would remedy those. Although, right, the compromise itself that gets hammered out has a lot of contours both to appease the small states, right, and the large states, so they both view this plan, the Constitution that we have, as a replacement for the articles that protected their interests. So that's what the constitutional compromise was. There's a lot in there. Again, please read it. Please take a look at it. But there's also a lot of rules and a lot of things we're going to talk about throughout the quarter that are not there. And it's important, right, to note of many of these things in their absence, as well as what is actually there. So with that, that's the end of this video. And thanks for listening.